the fake, delusional, and disingenuous. He stands as a beacon of truth. He is Abuki Cabal. You are listening to Abuki Cabal.
Welcome to the Abuki Cabal Show.
What's going on, everybody? All right. Back at it again. I know I did these out of order. I did two first, and now I'm going to do the first part. That's probably the order that they probably should have went in the first place. Seeing as how first wave feminism, kicked in first before sex was added to the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. So we're going to explore that a little bit and find out how that was inserted into the process, why it was inserted into the process, in order to give you a better idea of why these things are important today. So, excuse me. We're going to take a look at that. Alrighty. All right. Here's an article that I found in ThoughtCo. It's in the history and culture section. Let me see here. See which one starts first.
The real story behind.
Alrighty. Here it is. We'll start with this one first. And this one deals with this man right here, Representative Howard W. Smith. Okay. Gigi talked about him a couple of weeks back. So we're going to talk about him and go over why he's important. So here we go.
Because of sex. One of the most powerful phrases in the Civil Rights Act is often viewed as a malicious joke that backfired. But its entrance into American law was far more savvy than that. By Rebecca Onion. June 16, 20,205:54 p.m. The Supreme Court's decision on Monday in Bostock v. Clayton County, which extended employment discrimination protection to LGBTQ people based on Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, hinged on the briefest of phrases, because of sex. Among those with a taste for historical anecdote, it's long been passed down that this language was added to the bill because segregationist Representative Howard Smith, Democrat Virginia, thought that it would sound so ridiculous that it would sink the legislation's chances. It's a good story. Look at that racist troll cell phone. But that narrative, enjoyable though it may be, is not quite complete, wrote Christina Wohlbrecht, political scientist and author of The Politics of Women's Rights, Parties, Positions, and Change, in a Twitter thread. Smith later claimed he introduced the sex amendment as a joke, she wrote. Yes, it was introduced by a segregationist, but because women's rights advocates had laid the groundwork for decades, and because women members of Congress were there to shepherd it through the long legislative process. With this added context, Smith's little accident looks a bit more like somebody else's well-laid plan. I called Wohlbrecht up to find out more. Our conversation has been edited and condensed for clarity. Rebecca Onion, so Howard Smith, Democrat from Virginia, who inserted because of sex into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, was a segregationist. But he had other commitments that might have motivated him. What were those?
Okay, we'll stop it there for a second because I want to go back up here. I want to talk about these underlying parts here. The Supreme Court's decision on Monday in Bostock versus Clayton County, which extended employment discrimination protection to LGBTQ people based on the Title VII of 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Okay? Act. Hinged on the briefest of phrases, because of sex. And this is why we were talking about, why we always say that because of that small insertion there, it says because of sex. Didn't say because of sexual preference. Which I think is a better description of what that is, but it's not characterized that way. We see that, Title VII is being used to open up everyone else, but its intended targets for opportunities to be free of discrimination. Black people are still bearing the brunt of discrimination in this country. We're still a minority. We still have the smallest representation in government as far as members of office, higher office, state level offices. We still have those issues where we may be there, but our issues are not being addressed. They're either being shouted down or dismissed. And it would seem that these other groups, when they come to the table with far less people, and far less need, they tend to take priority as opposed to the people who it was originally intended for, which was black people. And if they had left sex off, I wonder what it would have been like. But even with them adding sex on, if it was levied as intended, then that discrimination against sex would have been more beneficial to those who had been the most victimized by discrimination based on sex, which was black women. But as you can see in the other, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, that, hey, middle class white women's needs were greater than any enslaved black person, male or female. So we see more of the same moving up to the 60s and the Civil Rights Bill. And, the article is discussing how this became more of a political tool for the empowerment of white women, as opposed to, as I said, the people who it was intended to protect. And its insertion was a ploy to basically get the whole bill smashed. They didn't want to give women, white women or black women, any rights or protections because of their sexual orientation, any more than they wanted to give blacks the right to vote. So what we see here is basically this guy's ploy, this representative, Howard Smith's ploy to try to smash the whole bill, which we see some of the same things, the tactics being employed today by Republicans who will basically add something into the bill to sink a whole bill that would be, 90% beneficial for the entire American public. But they'll sink it just for the sake of it not having been passed under a Democratic president or under a Democratic Congress or Senate. Those are the types of things that happen because they don't want, one side to get credit or the other. But you rarely see that coming from the Democratic side. You see that a lot from the Republican side. And even now you hear with some of the rhetoric that's being talked about right now is that, they don't want to take credit for anything that happened under Trump. But under Biden, it was better under Trump than under Biden. When we know historically, all you have to do is just look at the data. Historically, this country has done better under Democratic leadership than it has under Republicans. And usually the Democrats come in and have to clean up the mess that the Republicans have made, because time after time they show that they are unable to govern. But people vote off of their feelings and not necessarily off of facts and data. So we find ourselves in a precarious position, just like these people did here. You know, they felt like their backs were against the wall and they didn't want to give blacks the right to vote. So they tried to do everything that they could to try to sink the bill, as opposed to getting the bill passed. And then once the bill passed, this led to a number of the Dixiecrats, you know, which was an arm of the Democratic Party, to switch sides, the racist arm of the Democratic Party, to switch sides to the Republicans. Whereas historically the Republicans have been, were pro civil rights and freeing slaves. You know, you saw the dynamic change. And one of the threats that was levied to Lyndon Baines Johnson was that if he signed this bill into law, that the Democrats would never control the South ever again. And they have yet to control the South since that threat was made in 1964. Was it 65? Okay. So let's move on down here and finish it up.
Tina Wolbrecht, part of this history is just these stories of long alliances. Howard Smith was around 80 years old in 1964. Like a lot of Southern Democrats, he'd been in office forever. His connection with the National Woman's Party was that he had often been a sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment in the House. From the time Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party proposed the ERA in the 1920s, through when it was passed by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification in the early 1970s. The amendment was introduced in almost every Congress. Why would Smith do this? Between the 1920s and the time Congress was drafting the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the discussion among progressives and women's rights advocates had to do with what the best way was to guarantee women's equality. The National Woman's Party thought the way was to say that men and women should be treated exactly the same in front of the law. But there was a long-standing, well-established tradition coming out of the progressive movement, saying that groups that suffered discrimination and faced other barriers needed protective laws that treated them differently. So, for example, that women workers didn't have to carry as much weight or work long hours. In the early 20th century, the Supreme Court basically said that all these attempts by labor unions to get the government to limit hours that laborers have to work, or protect health and safety, were not the business of the government, since that interfered with the right to contract. Court said, if they're offering X amount of money for Y amount of hours, labor has the freedom to do something else, and it wasn't the government's business to intervene. That's the ideology of free labor. Right. But in the early 20th century, despite generally refusing the demands of labor, courts did say that governments could pass laws to protect women workers, because they're supposedly more delicate, fragile, and special. See the 1908 Supreme Court decision Muller v. Oregon. The progressive movement pushed to pass these kinds of laws that treated women workers differently. The idea was, one day, those laws would be the wedge. One day, you'd get protections for every worker, which is what eventually happened. But in the first half of the 20th century, this was a philosophical difference, right? Between some women's rights organizations and other progressives. Some people thought that something like an equal rights amendment for women, or even just adding because of sex to Title VII, would eliminate those protections for women. Would that be better, or worse, for women? That was a question of belief. So this was the ongoing argument. In the 1950s and 1960s, some people who didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment weren't supportive because they were pro-labor, and the ERA was seen as getting rid of these protections. And to be more cynical about it, some people were in opposition because if women were allowed to compete equally with men in the workplace, that might undermine the idea of the family wage, lower wages for everyone, and increase the size of the labor pool. The idea was power might shift from labor to employers, as a consequence. Right. Now the South was traditionally unfriendly to labor, in the first half of the 20th century. There was lots of strong labor power in the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt. Some businesses would move their factories to the South because the climate was much more favorable there. So why would someone like Howard Smith constantly introduce the Equal Rights Amendment? Some of that might have been a commitment, I guess, to women's equality, but it was more about a Southern Democratic coalition that was looking to undermine labor.
Exactly. And that's still to this day. If you look at wages in the South are still stagnated compared to up north. People down south make a lot less than people up north with the same amount of education. And, you know, they tend to work longer hours. People who are less educated down here can, if they're of the right persuasion, can still get into positions that would normally take, you know, a black person, or any other minority. They would have to have, you know, master's and PhD level education in order to get those management positions. And that's still going on down here. Don't believe me? Go and talk to the EEOC. It's in there. And then most of these states are what they call right to work states, which is more like right to fire, but they're called right to work. So they can fire you for any reason. Most of the time what they tell you is that basically we just don't want to work with you anymore. And then they just cut you loose. And that could just be because, you know, your boss is being a dick that day, or they just don't particularly care for you, or they just don't want to work with you because you're black, or because you're gay, or because you're a woman, or whatever the case may be. They can pretty much do it in these states. So there's always a reach around, you know what I mean? So, and part of this was talking about, you know, some of the theories as to if sex was added, you know, what would that do? What would the consequences be? Would that, you know, hurt, you know, the family wage? Would it lower wages for everyone? Would it increase the size of the labor pool? It did increase the size of the labor pool, you know, which I think businesses, you know, used to their benefit. And I think that was the plan all along. You know, the family wage disappeared. Now, you know, everything was based on a two-payer system. You know, both members of the household were out and working, you know, which meant there was more money to be spent. Okay. That later moved into a lot more credit, you know, in the Reagan years. And people started buying things not, you know, based on savings, but based on credit. A lot more, which broke us out into all new territories of economics and finance. So did the wages lower? I think the wages stayed low for a little while, but then they started to increase. So, you know, if we look back in retrospect and we try to, you know, see, was this a beneficial thing? Well, we lost the family wage. We lost the stability that the family had during that time, which was, you know, people had time to spend together. People had time to eat at a dinner table. People rarely do that now. We lost a bit of our culture as a result of this. And that's on the other end of the spectrum. And takes us away from the central point, which is, you know, why did he do this? Why did he, you know, why was he, and, you know, you find a lot of people who try to make it seem like he was altruistic and trying to insert this, sex into it, but it was a killer measure and it almost succeeded, but we'll get into that.
So when the National Woman's Party tried to get Smith to add because of sex to Title VII, they were doing it with the knowledge of his possible motivations to sign on. Right. The party knew that part of his incentive would be less that he was committed to their cause, and more that this addition might make the bill look ridiculous. Now, they didn't want the bill to look ridiculous or to fail, but they understood the way you make political change. You keep introducing things. You keep pushing the idea until it becomes more accepted and more successful. There were all sorts of amendments proposed to all.
Okay, now I want you guys to, think about that. You keep pushing the idea until it becomes more acceptable and more successful. That same strategy was employed with this LGBTQ agenda. Each time they pushed something in each legislative session, whether it be bathrooms, some case regarding whether, somebody would bake a cake for them. It would be, some sort of sexual discrimination. Then you started getting off into sex changes, and then they put in that, these issues about these, these large numbers of trans people who were being murdered. I've already covered that. And the numbers are the numbers, but they're nowhere near the numbers of black men who are being killed, or black women, or white men, or Hispanics. So those numbers are relatively small, but the push behind the discrimination that trans people endure has been enlarged in the public view over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, to the point to where it has become the main championed cause. All of the momentum that the civil rights movement had gained, and people trying to push towards equality in education, employment, focus on black families, all of that's been siphoned off. And now it's being pushed towards LGBTQ agendas, the Me Too movement, and other feminist causes. All of these causes basically learned from what we did during civil rights, and basically employed this tactic, which was to keep pushing their ideas out there until it becomes more accepted and more successful. And then you'll have them teaching in your schools. You'll have them, like, the 70s feminists did. They took over sociological departments, psychology departments, philosophical departments. They're in science, to the point to where now they're almost trying to debunk, scientific facts in order to benefit them towards moving forward. The same with some of these feminist issues. Men can do anything that a woman can do anything that a man can do. We know that's not the case. And men are getting tired of it. And it's like, well, I'm not going to take it easy on you. If you're going to fight me, then I'm not going to take it easy on you. If you're going to play soccer against me, I'm not going to take it easy. If you're going to play football against me, I'm not going to take it easy on you. If you play basketball against me, I'm going to dunk all over you. You know what I mean? So that you can see what your actual ability is. Okay? So this is where you see a lot of the tactics that were going on during this came from the early feminists, and they're being utilized today by these other fringe groups that are basically the reason why there is little to no effort being pushed towards our community with regard to bolstering families or family values. It's more towards, black women, then the LGBTQ, then the feminist agendas. Those three are what's most important right now politically on one side of the aisle. Actually, on the other side of the aisle too, because they don't, look, Republicans aren't doing anything against it either. When it comes up, you look at their votes and you look how much they push against it, and you don't see it. They're not even talking about it. But let's move on. A lot of layers to this thing, as you can see.
Sorts of parts of the Civil Rights Act, And one of the interesting things is that the idea of attaching sex to other titles of the Civil Rights Act came up, and went nowhere. It's only this one that Smith introduced for Title VII, specifically about employment, that worked. The other person in this story was Martha Griffiths, a lawyer and a representative in Congress, from Michigan. Also a Democrat, like Smith, but a Northern Democrat. Right around the time the party was in its decades-long process of realignment. Right. Griffiths was the first woman ever to serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and was considered a brilliant strategist who understood the legislative process very well. She was also responsible for tons of women's rights legislation. She had the idea to add sex to Title VII. But she saw an interview where Howard Smith said he was thinking about doing it, and she immediately thought, I'll let him be the one to do it. He's going to bring all his Southern Democratic colleagues. Then Griffiths went around and worked her colleagues to gather their support. The women in Congress who were concerned about this, men too, some Republicans as well. When Smith introduced the...
Okay, I'm going to stop it there for a second because I have a thought here. Now, here's something that you notice anytime we have a black representative who's up there, you see these people are basically advocating for what they believe to be important, for whatever the community is. You have this woman up here who is clearly Miss Griffith, who was, clearly advocating for women. Okay. But then anytime black people are up there and they're advocating for black people, there's an issue, and for us to expect black women to advocate for black people and not just for black women, it seems like it's alien to people nowadays. But that's the way we used to do business. And I dare say that's the way we should get back to doing business. So this is another aspect of the article that I find fascinating, because we've moved so far away from how politics was actually done. And they have shamed black people into not wanting to appear to be doing too much for black people. And we saw this with Obama. I'm going to be the president for all Americans. Yeah, we know that. But what are you going to do for us? Now that you're up there, that's what we're talking about. That's why people are in politics, to move the needle in places where the needle needs to be moved. Okay. So that's just something to think about. Let's move on.
Amendment to Title VII. He read this spoof letter from a woman complaining that there are more women than men where she lives, and arguing, doesn't every woman have the right to a husband? Everyone was laughing. What a huge joke. How silly the idea of women's equality is. Griffiths stood up and said, if we needed some proof for the necessity of this amendment, this chamber just gave it to us. Pretty much silenced the place. When the bill went to the Senate, and said...
Okay, now listen to that. You have a woman who basically talked about her inability to be able to find a husband. But see, these new young ladies tend to think that basically these women were, enslaved and almost, belittled by being married to these men, and they didn't want to be in the house and they didn't want to be beholden to these men. But here you have a woman here. You have a historic account of a woman complaining because there were not enough men to go around. Okay, this is her quote. She says, doesn't every woman have the right to a husband? Everyone in the chambers laughing with a huge joke. What a huge joke. How silly the idea of women's equality is. Now they were looking at it in a crazy way, but this is important. What this woman felt, it was every woman's right to have a husband. Now today we have women saying that they don't need a husband. So again, we see how far we've moved from what's important. Let's move on.
Senators were attempting to fight the amendment. Griffiths went to President Johnson to convince him to support it, which he did. A defining feature of the American legislative process is that there are lots of places along the way where you can stop stuff from getting passed. So having an advocate like Griffiths who really focused on keeping the amendment in, through this very contentious process, made a big difference. Why do you think the story of the amendment gets told the way it does? Why does the addition of those words get characterized as something almost random? A chance of history, instead of the product of advocates' work? Honestly, that interpretation comes from evidence from the time period. An example would be that the actual first director of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was convened to enforce that part of the law, called the provision a fluke conceived out of wedlock. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And also, it's a great story. Right? It's one of those stories that persist. The idea that these segregationists were trying to kill something. And instead the one addition has been enormous for women. Sexual harassment law is almost entirely based on it. And now it's opened up protections for LGBTQ people, as well. But I think the more interesting story is the real story, which is more consistent with what we know about how politics works. Activists who cared about these issues worked on them, proposed them, lobbied for them, developed relationships, made public opinion shift, got people comfortable. They made it happen.
Okay. So there's that article. And then in the end of the article, we see what's most important. There's always this addition of how this one word opened up opportunities for white women and the LGBTQ people today are using Title VII in order to open this up for yet another group of people to siphon off more resources from its intended beneficiaries, Black people. Okay. And I find that, I mean, that is substantial, and it's I mean, I can't stress it enough, the importance of these efforts. And they just think they think it's nothing, you know, but this has opened up the way to resources being recommitted for LGBTQ farmers, when Black farmers are still being discriminated against to this day, for all kinds of things within employment and possible employment discrimination, or them not receiving money or other benefits that they feel like they should be able to be privy to. These things are all being reallocated to these people so as to not discriminate against them. That's what that has opened this up to. So, it's just like a pie. You only have so much pie. And when you start partitioning that pie up, the main beneficiary gets less and less and less. You know what I mean? You give some to the LGBTQ, which is stratified into several different layers. And then you give it to the white women, and then you get Black women. And then, you got the rest that's for Black people. Okay. That's the way it's all laid out now. And it's highly problematic and illogical, I would say. So let's move on to the next article. And this one is from the National Archives, and it talks about and I think I'm just going to do the summary on this one, but let's see what it has to say.
Women's Rights and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, color, or national origin in public places, schools, and employment. However, discrimination based on sex was not initially included in the proposed bill, and was only added as an amendment in Title VII in an attempt to prevent its passage. Congressman Howard Smith, DBA, chairman of the Rules Committee and a staunch opponent of civil rights, had let the bill, H.R. 7152, go to the full House only under the threat of a discharge petition. During the floor debate, he offered an amendment that added sex to the 4 original categories, but only in Title VII, Equal Employment Opportunity. Although Smith had supported the idea of an equal rights amendment for women for nearly 20 years at that point, his amendment to the Civil Rights Bill was likely intended to kill the measure. His plan did not have the desired effect, however, and the bill was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964.
Okay, so you see there that it's the National Archives doesn't paint as rosy a picture as the female historian here, who was talking about it in Slate. So, as we can see, they left off that little tidbit that Howard Smith was very much opposed to civil rights, and that's a way of saying he wasn't very partial to black folks. So there you have it. There's another little caveat to his position that shows you why people feel like he put it in there to kill the bill, and it clearly states in the National Archives what his motivation was. Let's move on.
After the bill was passed, the government began work on policies that would enforce the new laws. As a result, Executive Order 11,246 was issued on September 24, 1965, to address compliance with civil rights regulations. However, it made no mention of discrimination based on sex. The omission of women's rights did not go unnoticed. Many women and advocacy groups wrote to President Johnson, expressing the need to expand Executive Order 11,246 to include enforcement of discrimination against women. Following are samples of letters sent to President Johnson.
Okay, let's think about this for a minute. Okay, you got black people saying that basically the original reasons for the bill did not include sex. Okay, so black folks during that time and their ability to be able to move around, to go to work, to basically go shopping, to go to church, all those things were in the South were threatened with death, death or dismemberment, and or sexual assault, whatever the case may be, whatever they wanted to do to you at that time, it could be done, and you couldn't do a thing about it. If you fought, more of you would die, and in some cases, some people did. They always characterize it as if no one fought, no one did anything. They don't really tell you about the dozens of bodies that they found or that recovered in all manner of disarray, in ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, bogs, swamps, wherever they do you, wherever they dumped you. My father even had told me about places where a black person came up missing. They knew the first place to go look, and chances are that's where they would be. And the people who dumped them there were police officers, other people who were around town, whatever the case may be. But that was the time. My grandfather won't even talk about it. So that just goes to show you, my folks are still alive who actually endured some of these things, and you have people out here, especially young black folks, who say that it's inconsequential. We're tired of hearing about slavery. We're tired of hearing about civil rights. That was a long time ago, is what they say. We were more than that. We were kings. So that's the new narrative. So let's move on and cover a little bit more of this.
The president of the District of Columbia State Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs called the omission of sex in Executive Order 11,246 to the White House's attention several months later, as would other women's advocates. The National Organization for Women, NOW. Okay,
I'm going to stop it again there. So as you can see, all of the people who had the biggest issue with sex not being added were white women. They weren't black women, they were white women. Okay. And I'm sure they went and they tried to recruit black women to their cause to try to bolster their numbers, because that's what they always did. They did that all the way up to the 70s. And they bolstered their numbers, but they didn't necessarily want them to talk. Let us talk, and you just, you can just, be troops. So we saw that all the way up to, to the ERA and their push, and how basically they, silenced. They turned the mics off when, the Hispanic women and the black women tried to talk about what they thought was important about being women and what their communities needed. I mean, it's in a documentary. It's, what was it? Feminism, What Were We Thinking? It's on Netflix. If you hadn't seen it, watch that, and it'll show you. And it's candid about what they did to women of color when they tried to, talk about issues that were important to them. So let's move on. So you see that the hands that are moving behind the scenes, and what they were trying to do in order to gain some sort of foothold in the new order of things.
Formed in October 1966, lost no time in pressing President Johnson to realize the promise of equal employment opportunity for women contained in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. While praising him for his efforts to promote the advancement of women as employees of the federal government and of federal contractors through his Executive Order 11,246, the new organization's leaders also pointed out the omission of sex in its wording, and expressed disappointment that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, did not seem willing or able to carry out that part of the law's mandate. Among the emphases in President Johnson's Omnibus 1967 special message to the Congress on equal justice was the need to continue to expand opportunity in the areas covered by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. His remarks about addressing employment discrimination were framed solely in racial terms. However, so the leaders of the National Organization for Women, NOW, took the opportunity to remind him that those concerns applied to sex discrimination as well. They zeroed in again on the omission of sex from Executive Order 11,246 and urged him to correct it. The omission of sex in Executive Order 11,246 was finally rectified in Executive Order 11,375 on October 13, 1967. In a letter to President Johnson, the leaders of the National Organization for Women, NOW, hailed the correction, but remain unsatisfied with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's, EEOC, performance in making the new order effective. The letter was signed by Catherine Clarenbach, Betty Friedan, and Caroline Davis, officers of NOW from its inception, as well as Aileen Hernandez, who had announced her resignation from the EEOC over its lack of attention to women's issues a year before Executive Order 11,375 was issued.
Now you see. Yeah, I know you recognize one of those names there, Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. So you'll see what her, her motivations were, and she was not above line. She said, and she's been quoted as saying that, we're not above line to get things done for women, that to benefit women, So there it is. So you see, you had a bunch of, powerful feminists that were behind the push to make the president go ahead and sign, that executive order adding sex in. And they knew that adding sex in was not to benefit black women. It was to benefit them. They knew why they did it, and they benefited handsomely from their efforts to get that added. So let's finish this up.
The American Association of University Women, AAUW, also applauded the belated inclusion of women in Executive Order 11,375. Praise for the inclusion of women as beneficiaries of the federal government's ban on employment discrimination also came from black women's groups such as the National Association of Media Women. Frankie Freeman had been appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights by President Johnson and expressed her appreciation as president of the Black Women's Service sorority Delta Sigma Theta for the explicit addition of women to those protected from bias in employment. Alan Fisher, archivist, Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library and Museum.
Okay. So there you have that brief little summary. Okay. And, shout out to the Deltas for having their stamp on that historic occasion. As you can see, they mentioned Miss Hernandez last after, these other prominent feminists here, and they mentioned the Deltas last after all the rest of them, the very people who were supposed to benefit the most from, Civil Rights Bill, Black folks get mentioned last. And I wonder how much benefit they gain from women being added to that bill. I wonder if we can quantify that. Well, here, this is going to be pretty good. I'm going to add this into the description. It's National Archives. They have the documents for your viewing. And I'm sure there's some tasty nuggets in there. They have some little summaries here talking about what's in the documents. You can see the actual signatures, the actual letters, and efforts to try to push the signature the support of the president and the executive order. So you can see all of those things, and we'll move on to the last one here. And this will give another take on it. And we will finish this up. Let's go.
How Women Became Part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act by Lyndon Apikoski. Updated on February 4, 2020. Is there any truth to the legend that women's rights were included in the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964 as an attempt to defeat the bill? What Title VII says. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act makes it unlawful for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual, or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment, because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The now familiar list of categories. The law prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. However, the word sex was not added to Title VII until Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat from Virginia, introduced it in a one-word amendment to the bill in the House of Representatives in February 1964. Why sex discrimination was added. Adding the word sex to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act ensured that women would have a remedy to fight employment discrimination just as minorities would be able to fight racial discrimination. But Representative Howard Smith had previously gone on the record as opposing any federal civil rights legislation. Did he actually intend for his amendment to pass and the final bill to succeed? Or was he adding women's rights to the bill so that it would have less chance of success? Opposition. Why would legislators who were in favor of racial equality suddenly vote against civil rights legislation if it also prohibited discrimination against women? One theory is that many Northern Democrats who supported a Civil Rights Act to combat racism were also allied with labor unions. Some labor unions had opposed including women in employment legislation. Even some women's groups had opposed including sex discrimination in the legislation. They feared losing labor laws that protected women, including pregnant women and women in poverty. But did Rep. Smith think that his amendment would be defeated? Or that his amendment would pass and then the bill would be defeated? If labor union-aligned Democrats wanted to defeat the addition of sex, would they rather defeat the amendment than vote against the bill? Indicate.
Okay, so as you can see there, she mentioned that women's groups had opposed including sex discrimination in the legislation because they feared losing labor laws that protected women, including pregnant women and women in poverty. Okay, so there were protections for these women. And then they added sex to the amendment. Now, here in recent times, we've had to introduce other protections for pregnant women and for women in poverty. So it had some unintended effects, and effects that women's groups opposed. But you don't hear that, and now you have women wanting more and more protections, but yet saying that the reason why they want these is for equality. But it's not equality. It's separate and more. They want more than equality. They don't want just one equality. They want a superior status over what they consider to be patriarchal domination. Let's move on.
Of support. Representative Howard Smith himself claimed that he genuinely offered the amendment in support of women, not as a joke or an attempt to kill the bill. Rarely does a congressperson act entirely alone. There are multiple parties behind the scenes even when one person introduces a piece of legislation or an amendment. The National Woman's Party was behind the scenes of the Sex Discrimination Amendment. In fact, the NWP had been lobbying to include sex discrimination in law and policy for years. Also, Representative Howard Smith had worked with longtime women's rights activist Alice Paul, who had chaired the NWP. Meanwhile, the struggle for women's rights was not brand new. Support for the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, had been in the Democratic and Republican Party platforms for years. Arguments taken seriously. Representative Howard Smith also presented an argument about what would happen in the hypothetical scenario of a white woman and a black woman applying for a job. If the women encountered employer discrimination, would the black woman rely on the Civil Rights Act while the white woman had no recourse? His argument indicates that his support for including sex discrimination in the law was genuine, if for no other reason than to protect white women who would otherwise be left out. Other comments on the record. The issue of sex discrimination in employment was not introduced out of nowhere. Congress had passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963. Furthermore, Representative Howard Smith had previously stated his interest in including sex discrimination in civil rights legislation. In 1956, the NWP supported including sex discrimination in the purview of the Civil Rights Commission. At that time, Rep. Smith said that if the civil rights legislation he opposed was inevitable, then he certainly ought to try to do whatever good with it that we can. Many Southerners were opposed to legislation that forced integration, partly because they believed the federal government was unconstitutionally interfering with states' rights. Rep. Smith may have adamantly opposed what he saw as federal interference, but he may have also genuinely wanted to make the best of that interference when it did become law. The joke. Although there were reports of laughter on the floor of the House of Representatives at the time Rep. Smith introduced his amendment, the amusement was most likely due to a letter in support of women's rights that were read aloud. The letter presented statistics about the imbalance of men and women in the U.S. population and called for the government to attend to the right of unmarried women to find a husband. End results for Title VII and sex discrimination. Representative Martha Griffiths of Michigan strongly supported keeping women's rights in the bill. She led the fight to keep sex in the list of protected classes. The House voted twice on the amendment, passing it both times, and the Civil Rights Act was ultimately signed into law, with its ban on sex discrimination included. While historians continue to allude to Smith's Title VII sex amendment as an attempt to defeat the bill, other scholars point out that presumably congressional representatives have more productive ways to spend their time than inserting jokes into major pieces of revolutionary legislation.
Well, we know that's all crap. What about the filibuster? The filibuster is one big joke. It's just one big issue. It's one big distraction to basically make you so uncomfortable that you're just going on about your business and say, well, we just won't do it. So that doesn't hold water. But I thought you guys might find this to be interesting, and I will add these in. And here's another one that House X got into Title VII, persistent optimism as a maker of public policy. And this is in humanities and social science, online. Science is online. And it has a pretty decent paper on it. that was done by Joe Freeman, PhD. And yeah, it's pretty interesting as well, but it's a pretty long read. So if you want to get into this a little bit deeper, I will add that as well. You guys tell me what you think about Title VII and how important or you think it was. Do you think it was necessary? Do you think people would have done the right thing with regard to white women after that, black women got protections under the Civil Rights Bill? Would they have just done right and just, because they couldn't, discriminate against people the way they used to? Would they have basically just said, okay, well, since the black people are, we can't, treat them wrong, we're going to start treating them, better. Then we're going to treat white women better as well. Could that have been just a social movement in the right direction that was spurred on by the Civil Rights Bill, and later on something could have been added to protect women as a whole, but something excuse me, something separate from the Civil Rights Bill. But now it seems like the tactic now is, and even you see in gay organizations that they are starting to say now that they want to add their own provision in the Civil Rights Bill, just like women added sex in the Civil Rights Bill. Now they want to add, this, which is, I guess, sexual orientation to the Civil Rights Bill. And is that a thing? Is that justified? What do you guys think about that? I have so many questions. So many questions, so little time. But you guys, let me know what you think in the comment section. Please like, share, and subscribe. I am still trying to move along and find some interesting topics for you guys. Again, thanks for subbing to the channel and helping me to continue to do a good job. You guys have a great day, night, or evening whenever you're listening. And I'm out.
I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. A long way from